Your film is now ready to be shown.
Good morning. I'm Justin Hendrix, editor of Tech Policy Press, a nonprofit media and community venture intended to provoke new ideas, debate, and discussion at the intersection of technology and democracy. In the spring, I teach a course called Tech, Media, and Democracy that is a partnership of faculty at NYU, Cornell Tech, CUNY's Queens College, the New School, and Columbia Journalism School. We host a range of expert speakers on issues at the intersection of those topics, and graduate students in journalism, information science, computer science, media studies, and design collaborate to produce prototypes and investigations. A couple of weeks ago, we hosted Peter Pomerantzev, an author and researcher who is concerned with propaganda, polarization, and how we come to understand the world around us. Emily Bell, director of the Tao Center at Columbia and one of the faculty on the course, led the discussion, which ranges from topics including the information component of the war in Ukraine to the tension between democracy and authoritarianism to the role of journalism and technology in shaping public discourse. This recording of the conversation has been edited for brevity. Here's Emily Bell.
Peter, good evening. Great to see you. Tell us what you're doing at is it Washington International Airport that you're at tonight?
Yeah, I'm not. I'm far cooler than that. I'm at the Baltimore International Airport. I just taught my class at Hopkins, and now I was very lucky. I found a 9 p.m. flight that's going to take me to London. Then hopefully I'll make a flight to Warsaw. Then I jump in a car and drive across the border into Ukraine, onto a night train in Lviv. And Wednesday morning, I will be in Kiev in time for a conference about strategic communications, propaganda, and all the sorts of things we'll be talking about today.
You make it over there quite a bit. So since the invasion last year, you say that you've been going on a very regular basis.
Yeah, I go once, sometimes even twice a month, but at least once a month. And I've got some really strong sleeping pills that my doctor has given me. And without that, I'd be a broken man.
Yes. So tell us a bit about, because I really want to hear about what you're going to be discussing in terms of stratcoms and propaganda. But tell us a little bit about your impressions from really being in constant communication there, and also maybe incorporate a little bit about your own personal backgrounds and how you're tied to the region and what your perspectives have been on the past year, because I think we get obviously a very extruded version of it if we're just consuming it through US media, which I think is less engaged than European media.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I actually think that well, I'll do that question last. So I was born in Kiev to two parents who are Jewish Ukrainian. And in the Soviet Union, you defined your ethnicity in your passport. So whether you were Jewish or Ukrainian was something that was in your passport. I think most of my family is Jewish. I don't have a couple of people who define themselves as Ukrainian. But born there, and then we emigrated, or where we were exiled in 1978 when I was 9 months old. So I only really had time to throw up over the Soviet Union, and then my parents were out of there. And I ended up growing up in London because my dad got a job at the BBC World Service. So I'm accidentally British and now have been in America like 1.5 years. Actually, most of my family shares, so it's not that huge a move for me because most Soviet Jews who left the Soviet Union ended up in America or Israel. But my background, professionally speaking, is that I spent, after university, I spent 9 years in Moscow working in TV. I actually went to film school in Moscow as well. And I thought I'd be a great arty film director. And then, like most people go to film school, ended up making reality shows and, docs about like kids with 5 heads and sort of stuff that you do when you work in TV. But that gave me a chance to look at the Russian media system from the inside. And I saw the birth of this new type of authoritarianism, which was really reinventing propaganda. And now it's all over the world. You see it everywhere, from Hungary to Brazil to India. But Russia was a pioneer. And I got to describe it in my first book, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. And that was kind of a moment where I twigged where actually I was not a very good TV producer. I was actually quite crap at it. But I was an okay writer. And actually what I was fascinated by intellectually was the connection between media and democracy, essentially, and information democracy. And why the question that haunted me as I was making TV shows and documentaries and all the sort of things, like, why is this any good society? What impact is it having? Is it changing anything? Am I just getting ratings? In a system like Putin's, I wasn't making political stuff at all. I mean, it was very far from that, but even the entertainment stuff I was making was really bad. Then I came back to Britain still working in TV. So constantly as I worked in the industry going, okay, what does this mean for society? And then it's quite a natural sidestep, almost to see myself from the side and move into academia and to ask those questions in academia and then ask the next question, which is the question that I sort of have started asking myself since 2014, which is, okay, how do we create journalism in the broader sense of the word, media and communications, that is good for democracy? When is a documentary good for democracy? When is a reality show good for democracy? When is the way we frame news agendas good for democracy? How do we start researching that? So the last few years at the LSE and now Hopkins, I've been trialing really small boutique experiments in trying to understand that. I put journalists and sociologists together, trying to work out how you overcome polarization, if that's something you want to overcome. How do you reach audiences who might be impervious to the facts, who might be under the sway of conspiracy theories and other malign effects? The war has kind of actually, in many ways, sort of turbocharged my activity into reality. So since the war started, I've set up 1.5 NGOs. One of them looks at war crimes in Ukraine, but really thinks about the connection between truth and holding power accountable to the truth. So we research war crimes, we do stories around war crimes, and then we connect journalists with lawyers to start building cases. And what we're trying to do in a very experimental way is really try to think about how do we make the truth part of a process of justice, and how do we make justice a part of establishing truths. So that's one thing I've been doing. Another thing that I'm thinking about a lot, and I can talk about maybe in very general terms, is thinking about how do we engage Russian audiences. There's lots of initiatives around there. I've been doing a lot of sociology, a lot of polling, a lot of innovative polling, because it's hard to research a dictatorship, but really thinking, how are we going to start engaging the Russian population? And what does it mean to engage a population in a time of war? Is it really about converting them or persuading them that Putin has done a bad thing, that they're complicit in the war crimes of their country? Or what is actually the role of communication in a time of war? Does it change? And should we be doing something else?
So that's a great point to pick up on, which is that big question, and the question that you tackle at Agora as well, which is how do we actually do things that move the dial on this on schisms in society. So let's just stick with Russia and Ukraine for a moment. Have you seen I think there's a lot to talk about in terms of modern propaganda and what the perceptions of that conflict are from the outside, who is winning the information war, for want of a better phrase. But just in terms of that question that you asked about what can we do to engage Russian audiences or any audiences that need some kind of persuasion or rooting back in reality, do you have any thoughts about is that possible, do you think, with Russia at the moment? What's your understanding of how things are there? There's not a lot of independent media that's actually in the allowed at the moment in Russia, but obviously there are populations who are constantly looking for and interested in finding other sources of information.
So according to the polling that I've seen, there's around 60% of people who are unsatisfied with the media on offer, but only 17% of them follow the current independent media. So I don't think that's purely a question of censorship. I think a little bit like in America, they perceive the independent media as being elitist, as being too politicized, as not having their back, as not being interested in them and preaching to them. That's something we found in studies across the world. There's a lot of research in Hungary, doing a lot of research in the US now. There's also the question of not just the supply, but the demand. People don't necessarily feel that the independent media they're being given is the one that they want. So even though, well, I mean, it depends what poll you believe, but let's say around 60% of Russians want something outside of the state media diet that they're given, neither are they drawn to the independent stuff. So it's not purely a case of censorship. The censorship I'm sure, plays a role as well. So I suppose the question then becomes, how do you reach this 40%? How do you reach the 40% who are maybe not the kind of like classic liberal audience, but who are unsatisfied with the dictatorial diet? What interests them? When do they feel that they're being listened to, that their concerns are being addressed? And then you get into very difficult choices, because we want to scream at them, you're committing war crimes in Mariupol. That might not be what they're ready to hear. So if you ever want to get to, can you please face the reality of what you're doing in Mariupol? Mariupol is a town that's been bombed to smithereens by Moscow. Maybe start somewhere else. And that's a very kind of audience-first approach, which I think in a context like Russia's reaches an intensity, but really is I think what a lot of people are finding when we think about America. I mean, our mutual friend, Jeff Jarvis, for all my differences with him, I think on this we're completely aligned that, if you want, stop talking about the audience being bad or wrong or stupid or zombified. Think about how you're going to reach them. So, no, the polling shows that you can reach them. Sadly, it won't be with lectures on the virtues of liberal democracy. It'll probably be about something else, something that they really care about. It might well be, consumer price shows about how the quality of sausages is going down. And then going, well, you realize the quality of sausages is going down because you started a bloody war. But you probably start with sausages. You don't start with Mariupol, however much we would like to.
Right. And tell me about, I was reading actually on Justin's excellent Tech Policy Press earlier this week. Josh Tucker wrote a piece, another NYU professor, about, on balance, how the information war has progressed in the past year, and said that there is an assumption in the West that everything we see suggests that Ukraine has really done an incredible job of keeping people very much focused on it and supporting it. But that's a very Americentric view. When you step outside that, it's not clear that Russia is necessarily suffering in the rest of the world, and that this is this, if you like, is an open question. Is that, what do you think about that? Have you been thinking about sort of what the optics are at the moment and what the stakes are in terms of those optics?
Definitely have. I haven't been super focused on that because there's a lot of people doing that, and this war has been so hectic. I've really been thinking about where I can add the most value myself. But there are a lot of people doing that, and I talk to them a lot. And in this trip to Kiev, I think most of the discussion will be about that. So I actually still think would frame it in terms of progress. I still think Russia's. Can we swear?
Yeah.
So yeah, Russia fucked up. So even you're going to understand where they were starting from in Latin America. Again, I didn't like this idea of Latin America. In certain countries in Latin America, support for Russia was super high. In certain countries in Africa and the Middle East, support for Russia was super high. It has actually, in places where it was always super high because of historical reasons, for example, friendship with the Soviet Union, because of Russia's investment in those regions, because they're, probably quite justified anti post-colonial and anti-Western sentiments. For all, Russia actually had a huge advantage. So even though things there probably still look awful, where people are on the fence or they're debating where they are, or it's a bit mixed, I actually think even there's some progress in the right direction. For example, a lot of countries actually in Africa and the Middle East have a very transactional relationship with Russia. I think any of the stuff that's going on in Europe is, moral or existential. They just see a bunch of Europeans fighting each other. But they did have an image of Russia as a security guarantor. Yeah, Russia was going to provide them weapons, Russia was going to provide them mercenaries, energy, and they saw Russia as a useful kind of hedge between America and China. Russia's disasters on the battlefield have not gone unnoticed. The fact that Russia is pulling out troops out of Syria and from other places has not gone unnoticed. So, I mean, Russia's done an amazing job especially in the Syrian conflict, in showing that it's just sort of like this hard man of the world that turn up and sort out your problems. If you're a dictator in trouble, it's not the A team, it's like the dictator team. Call the D team, and Putin will turn up with like some troll farms and some mercenaries and some nuclear deals and some cash bailouts. They've been cultivating that image really, really, really successfully over the last 20 years. Suddenly they're like, okay, you start stupid wars. You clearly haven't worked this out. You've clearly lost in the battlefield. What's going on? So again, India, another country that's classically seen Russia as an ally, definitely wants to stay out of any Western imbroglios, definitely doesn't trust the US. It's interesting looking at the polling. So it's evenly matched. It's like 70% Indians pro-Russian because of geopolitics, because they've always seen Russia as a partner. 17%, don't quote me on these numbers, still around 17%, are like Ukraine because of the story, because they sympathize with Ukraine, and the rest are in the middle. So you've got to understand that in a lot of places, Russia was at a really, really strong point. So even there, I think there's some question marks. I don't think it's won in those areas, but it's definitely not losing because they were always winning there. I mean, those were their allies and their partners and their friends of convenience often. I wouldn't romanticize the relationship, but for a lot of African dictatorships, for a lot of Latin American regimes, Russia was a useful partner.
So when we talk about propaganda, we set up a spreadsheet just logging all of the various changes to communications infrastructure rules, censorship, etc., that started sort of tracking from the day of the invasion. And I think we've got about 500 lines or something of it so far. We saw things, I think, in the first few months of the war that we hadn't seen before, like, for instance, the European Union saying we're going to take RT off all of our transponders. You know, if you have a European Union transponder, you can't carry this kind of thing. So reflecting on some of that activity, what have we learned? Because it's part of modern warfare is obviously the information war. It moves during every conflict. You have very online populations on both sides of the divide here. So is there anything that we've learned from the official reaction to it, from the journalism it's produced, and from the activities of the propagandists?
It's always evolving, and it's evolving with the tech. And often the best way to look is at what do the marketing companies do it? And you'll see there's links to it a little bit later. Like, it's one technology they're exploiting. So that's, that's probably sort of evolving in line with that. I'd actually point in a different direction this time. I mean, all those things that we've been studying since 2016, which, what's happening on Twitter, what's happening on, I spent so much of my time on Discord at one point. I was really into Discord, researching it. You know what Discord is? It's a gaming site. And, we spent so much time looking at the technology of tech. How do we regulate it? That all now feels like the sort of like the little cartoons before the feature presentation in the movie theater. I don't know if everybody understands that metaphor, but when you go to the movies, you used to have all these ads and then maybe a little cartoon and then the feature presentation. And now Russia's doing a feature presentation, which is much bigger. And in the sense that, yes, there's Russian stuff on Facebook saying that, a war, an atrocity didn't take place or was staged like they did in Syria. But much more than that, they're saying, oh yeah, we're doing this and we're going to get away with it. Oh, you can put everything on your Google archive and we will get away with it. What they're kind of saying is like, and much more kind of bullshit way, is, oh, we're going to do it and it doesn't matter. We're here to overturn the connection between information and, I hate this term, like the world order, but definitely between information and justice. We have more evidence and documentation than ever before of war crimes. We already had this in Syria. We have even more than in Syria now. The more we have, the less it seems to matter in some strange way. That's the tension we're in. Let's say we collect all this evidence. Let's say we have all these tribunals. And it doesn't matter because it's a world where Russia and China get to set the rules, and it just doesn't matter. That's what they're going for. I hope they fail, but they sort of up the stakes from troll farms on Facebook. They're really sort of going to the end of their logic. I mean, one of the many wars that are happening, and there's many wars happening in Ukraine at the same time. There's a colonial war, Russia's rebellion against the world order. There's so many conflicts happening at the same time. But one of them is about, and the one that I suppose I'm really fascinated by is the one between, can evidence and truth mean anything? And we could think of that war as its own war. It just had a huge war around COVID. COVID was already this huge kind of battle between do truth and evidence matter when it's people's health at stake. And we found out that it sometimes people will take evidence-free decisions even when their health is at stake. It's quite incredible, really. And Russia's taking it even further. So maybe we should write this book, Justin, Emily, everyone else, The War Against Reality, but not the way I did it, which was a series of tactical skirmishes. But maybe there's a grand narrative here that we're missing. This escalation of just saying fuck the facts. And again, Russia is just taking it to a new level.
It does. I think that's a really interesting point. I've been reading some of the Dominion depositions today, which is the lawsuit against Fox News brought by
part of the story. I saw that connection as well when I was like, okay, this is part of the same dynamic.
Right.
What really matters. Oh no, maybe I should write this.
So it's very good. It's like workshopping books during class. But I think it's because I've been thinking about it as almost like the end of shame. But you're right, it's not actually about the end of shame. It's something much bigger than that, which is if you can perpetrate these things and get away with them. So if you can sit in Rupert Murdoch's position, and the deposition papers that came out today showed that he, as the head of Fox News, knew full well that what was going on his channel in terms of saying there was voter fraud was not true. And there was no ambiguity about it. And there's a wonderful, or horrible phrase that he uses where he says it's not the blue, it's not the red, it's the green. So in other words, it just means money. So it's not really a political thing. It's an apolitical thing.
He said that.
Yeah. You couldn't make it up. As a Succession script writer,
I know, I was going to say. That's amazing.
It's such an amazing phrase. It's not the blue, it's not the red, it's the green. So in that world, and we're talking about the role of journalism in democracy, one of the things that haunts me teaching journalists is what difference can we make? What are we doing here? What's the role, not just of journalists, we've also got technologists and sociologists in this class who are all thinking, is there any point when you get these really significant, as you say, main presentation features, and the point of them is to essentially say your existence as a professional who stands against these things doesn't matter. What is it that we can and should be doing?
I mean, that's exactly the crisis I kind of threw me into the sort of like the sewer between policy and academia where I now dwell. And out of, I still write books, I still write articles, but I used to never leave an editing suite. So to really trying to make sense of what the hell are we doing? Yeah, I mean, so many fundamental questions are being challenged. I think what we've got to do is throw out some bad metaphors that we lived by, that were mythical, the marketplace of ideas, the truth will save us, or truth can speak, you can speak truth to power. We had our own cliches that we worked in, and that what we just had as assumptions, which are blatantly were never really corroborated and were never thought through, and we just lived with them. Like, you ask journalists what they're doing, well, yeah, no, I find the truth and that's good. And that changes things. Like, does it? I mean, it is to misquote a boring German philosopher, the structural disintegration of the public sphere that we're talking about. So it'll take the whole thing. There is a technological bit to it. How do we create environments, online environments, so that's what we're talking about now, where facts matter, and what is civic discourse and what is democratic discourse, this weird spongy thing that we never really thought about too much, but we now realize it's just key. It's the key force, if I'm going to use a Star Wars metaphor, that sort of informs democracy, but like very hard to define. You kind of know when it's gone. Because suddenly you have these communities which are unable to function, or non-communities. So how do you create online environments that are geared towards making that better? And we can talk about many examples, Taiwan and whatever. But then how do we then create a technological economy of that? Yeah, because it's not profitable to do these things. So who's going to fund it? And that's a huge part of it. How do we build these environments? And obviously people like Eli Parasar and Ethan Zuckerman are the great gurus of that. What worries me is that all the gurus are in America, but the actual regulation that might help create that is going to be in Europe, and there's no gurus there. So I think we're cross-pollinating a bit here.
Right.
So that's those guys. But and there's a regulatory piece. So one of the big things actually that I'm going to be speaking on in Kiev, and that I'm just starting now, which is a controversial line, which is what is the legal culpability of Russian propagandists on this conflict? How do we delineate between freedom of expression, however abhorrent it is? And I'm very much in the you can pretty much say whatever you want side of things, and targeted, coordinated information operations which aid and abet crimes. Yeah, how do we find that line? How do we find a language around that? Yeah. And I think the Russian propagandists are a good place to start, but we saw it in Myanmar, we saw it we see it in Mexico, the narcos, we go on and on and on. This, integration of information operations into military operations, into political repressions, geared specifically created, calculated to commit crimes. And how do we start passing that apart? So there's a big regulatory piece to think about there. There's a regulatory piece to think about regulating the online space. So there's a regulatory piece, reimagining that. There's a technology piece. And then there's what I suppose I'm still very interested in, which is the content piece. Because however much you regulate the space, however much you regulate it, however much you technologize it, it is going to be about people and content they create. And it would be kind of creepy if it wasn't. How do we create, in very different situations, how does a journalist or a communicator or whatever this weird profession is that we're still in, how do you get up in the morning thinking what I'm doing is having some sort of effect beyond clicks, and ratings. So with what we're doing in Ukraine, with the Reckoning Project, with my friend Ginny Di Giovanni, and we may have seen we've had a lot of materials out this last week in the Atlantic and other places. I mean, that's about connecting journalism with justice, putting lawyers and journalists together, which was very controversial when I raised the idea with the head of Google News, who's a veteran AP and BBC guy. He was like, this goes, he was very nice, but he was like, this goes against his sense of journalistic ethics. As far as he was concerned, journalists and lawyers should never talk to each other. They're different professions, they're competing professions. If lawyers were to come and ask for material, from journalists, they would ask for a subpoena, we're not giving you any material. We're doing the opposite. We want to give lawyers the material. We see ourselves in one single community of evidence gathering and establishing the truth and fighting for the truth. And it's not just journalists. It's journalists, kind of teachers, first responders, whoever's getting to the evidence first. How do they get that to the justice system? And then how do they reinforce the justice system by explaining to the public these stories? So look, that's a big shift away from, what journalism may have thought it was doing before. What I've been thinking about a lot previously, and my US research is still focused on this, is how do you reach audiences that are not on your side? So I do think there's a bad tendency, both market-driven, but also often from donors, which confuses me why they do this, but I don't know, they just seem to, which is like when we create media or when we fund media, it's like find your audience and kind of milk them. You found your sort of your little slice of the pie. Now it's up to you to extract as much as you can from it, which almost always means polarizing in some way. It almost always means creating an identity that might be quite guarded and quite closed to a certain extent for them, and defining their enemies. That's just how you build these things, sadly. And, I'm very excited by the idea of media or a journalist who gets up in the morning going, okay, how do I start connecting this audience and this audience? How do I tell the story of, let's say, Reconstruction, which is where, because I'm looking at US history at the moment, to audiences that are reticent about the way it's been told so far, or have very strong cultural or historical or judicial barriers against listening to the story? How do I do that? How do I tell the story so they will listen to me? So that's what I've always been very excited by, and by that challenge. And that in a way, that's a very old mission. We shouldn't think that we haven't been here before. We had very similar crises at the start of the 20th century, and they were eventually overcome after 2 world wars, a Holocaust, and many other crises, but they were overcome. So when you say give up, there's things to do: regulatory space, design space, innovation and media space, which make me not despair. And also the historical record, though glum in its own way, we've been here before. We were here with the advent of radio, where you had the same euphoria with the advent of radio as you had with the advent of the internet. Very quickly, that's replaced with horror as Stalin and Hitler weaponized the radio. Very similar paranoia about the power of propaganda, of zombifying people. Very, very similar sort of pathologies as we have now. And at the end of the day, the democratic side of things finds a way to respond through many means.
With regards to your work with the truth, justice, truth dynamic, how do you identify who in society contains truth? And as a follow-up to this, when the truth or justice is antithetical to the ideological, institutional and or power-holding majority, how can you effectively share this truth in order to impact or make a change in momentum? Which is, so that's going back to, I think, your point about we might have to just not do journalism as we've done in the past, which has tended to reflect and embody some of the institutional truths. That's all question about identity is, I think, is a really good one.
So you're asking, how do you make sure that the justice is for everyone and not just for the people already advanced by the system? Is that what you're asking?
Well, if I was going to say, we can elucidate, but I think from reading it, it's like, how do you decide who holds the truth? So people have different perspectives on this, and what happens when that truth is opposed to the power holding majority. So you might look at America and say there is one truth about how America came into being, which pretty much overwrites the rights of a minority. And then if you're part of that minority, you see pretty much everything reflected in the media as being not true, or certainly not reflective of your experience. And I do think that we're grappling with that a lot at the moment, aren't we, in terms of who gets to say what is true.
I think that's a fantastic question. And I think it's almost like, let's take that question and think about sort of the two branches that one could take that in. So Sean Hannity says that. Yeah, Sean Hannity, and I've watched a lot of Sean Hannity, say there is no such thing as objective truth. CBS is really biased. He'll actually use very, very good stats showing how much more CBS sort of grilled Trump than they grilled Obama. Yeah, so he'll use some truth. There's truth in now that everyone's biased. All that's left is hardcore feeling. And in this world of darkness, lying, obfuscation, Foucauldian knowledge captured by power, he doesn't quote Foucault, but he really explains Foucault very well. There are no rules. There's just emotion. And of course, only Donald Trump can lead us through this dark, evil, biased world. It's exactly the same message that you hear on Kremlin TV, Dmitry Kiselyov. Again, war against any hope for ever being objective. They will raise perfectly legitimate criticisms occasionally of Western media, or the BBC or CNN, and say, haha, look, that side lies. It's a world of darkness and lies. Only Putin, only force. Truth is a myth, justice is a myth. Only the strong hand of a strong leader can lead us through a war of all against all. So you can take that idea and take it that way. Or you can take it the other way, saying, yes, obviously truth is an emergent thing. Nobody has a monopoly on the truth, but we have certain ideas about how we might agree with what evidence is. And so when a new truth emerges, we can sort of tentatively agree that we respect it. We don't dehumanize the other side who are bringing their ideas forward, et cetera, et cetera. I'm from the humanities. I went to film school before that. I studied English Lit. I'm not a social scientist. I mean, the idea for me that there would be like a rock solid truth that is owed by someone, usually by somebody in the social science department, is for me fairly horrific. So what we're really talking about are, fora environments. I work at somewhere called the Agora, which is some sort of reference to a very, very imperfect Greek ideal of a space where you talk to each other and listen to each other. So we're talking about communities, environments, where truths can emerge, where people have access to it and access to a voice, and all these ideals of this woolly notion of a public sphere. So we talked about Dr. Fauci, just before this as well. It sounds like it could well be that there is a chance that the virus may have. I don't know. Emily was saying this. I don't know this. Emily was saying there's a chance.
Wait.
Emily was saying. I didn't say with it. But there is a chance that maybe the virus did emerge from the lab. I mean, fine. These are all things that in a respectful public sphere you can debate and talk about it. It doesn't become some sort of fetish that you chop people's heads off with. Overall, as somebody from England, which has actually got a much more calcified process of access to the public sphere, America is deeply, deeply messed up. But I kind of love the debate you guys are having here. It's such a as long as people are bursting for their right to speak and tell their story and tell their American story, and it can well be there's time to split up the American story into many stories and to dilute some of these mythical sort of pressure points in American history that do feel a tiny bit kind of like a little bit Soviet to me sometimes. When I'm just like this sort of obsession with the founding fathers, things terribly like Marx and Lenin. That's a very healthy thing, breaking up those myths and bringing in new perspectives. And as long as that's being done, and I think it largely is in the US, frankly, with a desire to sort of like find more facts and more truths and deeper meanings, rather than just to say, oh, well, then nothing matters. All that matters is violence.
Is there a way of doing this proactively? So in other words, is there a way of making these interventions proactively? Because we are in a very reactive field. This is something I think that particularly when it comes to disinformation, I know you and I have had this conversation separately, Peter, about the hunting of propaganda in some ways is always counterproductive. So what are the chances that we can actually make interventions but before it comes to this? Or is it just that we're working in too dynamic and difficult a field for that?
I've spoken to many data researchers who say they can spot things emerging early, which is interesting, like a bubble forming or sort of a community forming that's becoming more and more extreme or alternative, So there are data people who say they can see this emerging very early. I'm not a sort of a data guy that way. All our evidence, all our research shows that, take something like conspiracy theories. So we looked at conspiracy theories in Eastern Europe a lot. Conspiracy theories, conspiracy mindsets are very popular among parts of the populations that have a very deep lack of sense of agency. This probably isn't, huge news to anybody who's in this session. Often that's accompanied by things like civic deserts, so the lack of local communities, lack of local media, but really on a much more fundamental level, really just feeling that you've been left behind, but also that you don't have any way of influencing society. For many reasons, in Eastern Europe, there are many historical reasons. But we know historically that is where people become very susceptible to a type of communication. Let's not call it propaganda, but let's call it communication, which will then create a false community for them, a false sense of us, where they can project their sense of agency and strength, often through a leader, and through maybe seeing other groups as at fault for their feelings, and also towards other groups they can feel superior to. So I'm sure we'd be able to track that and see it develop. I don't think any of this is hard, Emily, to track and spot and anticipate. It really isn't. It's very human stuff. And you just go to these places and go, oh my God, these people feel really abandoned. And, there's going to be some political snake oil salesman who's going to turn up soon. The problem isn't so much working it out. The problem is whose job is it to fix it? And what is the motivation? Because there is zero financial motivation to do this. Actually, the financial motivation is exactly the opposite. Right. And that's why I really worry about the US. I see brilliant people thinking about it. I see brilliant people in universities defining it. It really isn't that hard to preempt, to spot the problems before they emerge. Whose job is it? There's nobody. And all we have is like foundations doing like funding, where I see like small, really worthy, tiny media. They're not going to compete with what was it with you just quoted Murdoch. He's an obvious villain in this. So the question for me again is like, whose job is it and who's going to pay for it? And just in Europe, you have this idea of this should be the job of what used to be public service media. No, they will have to transform hugely to deal with this as well.
Talking about other parts of the world, the technological landscape, saying this is not propaganda. You also mentioned protests as opposition in China, but the past 7 or 8 years, as China's changed technologically so much. How has that sort of changed the protest media landscape? I guess we have, such a difference now in terms of surveillance technologies, etc. And I guess a related question, which says, could you speak a bit more about the success you've seen in Taiwan in countering missile disinformation?
Yeah, I mean, I think, cases like studying in Taiwan, for them it's existential to resist, these sort of experiments in authoritarian information operations. So they do a lot there. But again, what I'd say is the most interesting thing in Taiwan is their attempts to build resilient spaces. I think now almost the story of Audrey Tang and V Taiwan is almost become sort of like a parable that probably should be now debunked in some way, because it's become almost too well known. Yes, the Taiwanese had all these groups looking for Chinese disinformation online and countering it and doing all that stuff, but and that was great. That showed how sort of activists could respond to a state challenge, which was very interesting. But what was much more interesting for me in Taiwan was these attempts to use tech for good and create online spaces which was specifically designed for debating policy issues in a way that reached consensus and stuff. So it's not just the defensive bit; it's also creating online environments that are helpful for democratic processes. I mean, China. My chapter on China I was there just as Xi Jinping was going full dictator. He just changed the constitution to make himself sort of leader for much longer than was originally intended. And it was sort of really, there was a real sense that, oh wow, the semi-open period was over and we're entering something much darker and new. China is I'm not a China expert, but I watch it from this point of view, from the point of view of propaganda and also from their vision of how information is meant to work with society. And I don't know how many of you watched the Chinese, the CCP 100 years celebration. This is the Chinese Communist Party had their celebration of 100 years of the Communist Party. And it was this huge show, very Soviet, dare I say. It was like mass scenes from Mao's childhood and the Civil War and, the Great Leap Forward, all mass scenes, all choreographed, depicting the ideals of mass society, I suppose. But what was very interesting was the end. So they go through all these scenes of the Chinese Communist Party, spectacular set pieces on this huge stage with all the Politburo watching and applauding. And they get to the future. And this huge number 5 descends from the roof of the theater. It's a huge theater. And first I thought 5, it must be the 5-year plan. This was like a Soviet communist thing. Yeah. Every 5 years the leaders of the Communist Party would say, here's the 5-year plan. And everyone lived by the 5-year economic plan. And it wasn't, it was 5G. The 5G was coming down. And it was sort of bathing the future of China in this beauty. People were almost like praying to it. And I was like, Xi Jinping plus 5G is the future. They have, or they appear to have, a vision of the future where centralization and mass control is enabled by online technology, but also kind of the two meet perfectly, as in like in this data-driven society, you can only rule it by centralizing it. Maybe centralization didn't work in the 20th century because we didn't have enough data. But now that we have all the data, it's time to give it all onto the leadership, because liberal democracy, look at America, it's a mess. Look at their crazy elections. Look at their crazy paralysis in Congress. Humanity can't deal with this amount of information. Humanity can't process it. The only thing that can process it is a centralized power that will design the ideal city for you. Yes, you will give up all your freedoms, but there won't be any traffic jams. The pollution will be minimal. We'll use your data to find you the ideal job, the ideal wife, the ideal sexual position. I'm getting carried away. They didn't do that, but that sort of thing. Give us your data and give us your freedom of choice, and we will decide better. Now, obviously, I'm caricaturing, but that's kind of the idea. It's a, I don't know how many of you have been asked to read the Dewey-Lippmann debate from the 1920s in the US. It's exactly the same debate all over again. Yeah, in a world of an overabundance of information, democracy just cannot deal with it. Democracy was meant for small, town halls. That was the idea that Walter Lippmann had, a great American columnist. And he would argue in the 1920s, a lot like Xi Jinping is arguing now, it's too chaotic. You've got to have an elite that makes centralized decisions, that can process the data, make sense of it. And the sun is set on your messy democracy. You may have kind of lost your way through the 20th century, but it's over. My sense is there's a few people in Silicon Valley who feel the same way, but there does seem to be an authoritarian strain in Silicon Valley as well. Again, not all of them. There's many others who aren't. There's a very interesting cycle between libertarianism that has led into authoritarianism, which is very interesting. Which I can barely grasp, but I kind of get it now. If the only freedom that matters is private property, who can defend private property? Only the king. That's how they seem to have got there. But weirdly, there is this blending between libertarian thinking and authoritarian thinking, which you would think would be antithetical. But sticking with, I'm not a political philosopher, but this is again, and this is what interests me about propaganda, about media. It is not just the case of tactics and technology. We do get into these big questions about what is freedom, is democracy possible, and sort of what is the human. That's at the end of the day is the subject of my books. I use propaganda as a way to get to the question of when are we free? When do you know that your thoughts are your thoughts? When are you actually being manipulated and when not? And when can you make decisions? And when can we make decisions as communities?
So, Peter, we've kept you longer. I'm worried about you missing your plane at some point.
No, it's all right. It's all right. I got here really early.
I was going to say, even more worried about you missing your beer. Thanks very much indeed, Peter. Great to spend some time in the presence of a sweary British journalist. Always makes me feel very much at home.
That's it for this episode. I hope you'll send your feedback. You can write to me at justin@techpolicy.press or find us on Twitter @techpolicypress. Thanks to the speakers, thanks to my co-founder Brian Jones, and thank you for listening.
Tech Policy Press.